Hello and welcome to another episode of Kanada Mit C, or in English, Canada with a C. My name is Annika Vaikinnes. I'm the project manager of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Canada. Today's episode will take a closer look at Canada's past and present relations with its Indigenous population. Indigenous people is a collective name for the original peoples of North America and their descendants. Based on the 2016 census by Statistic Canada, more than 1.67 million people identify themselves as Indigenous, which is equivalent to 5% of Canada's population. The Canadian Constitution recognizes three groups of Indigenous peoples: First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. The First Nations people were the original inhabitants of the land that is now Canada and represent the largest group of Indigenous people with about 1 million people, 50 nations, and 50 Indigenous languages. The Inuit primarily inhabit the northern regions of Canada and live in parts of Labrador and Quebec, Nunavut, and the Northwest Territories, with a population of about 65,000 people. The Métis understand themselves as a people that emerged as a political community linked to the Red River settlement area in the 19th century. Currently, about 600,000 people have identified themselves as Métis on the census. All three Indigenous groups have their distinct cultural practices, languages, arts, histories, and traditions. Canada celebrates its national day, simply called Canada Day, every year on July 1st. Traditionally, this holiday is celebrated with backyard barbecues and fireworks, much like July 4th in the United States. However, this year the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said the day would be a time for reflection. The recent discovery of unmarked graves containing the remains of Indigenous children has shocked many Canadians, caused deep grief in Indigenous communities, and sparked a new debate about Canada's colonial policies. Canada's colonial past is widely acknowledged by the Canadian government, and one of the most striking features of this past is the residential school system. Between 1893 and 1996, more than 150,000 Indigenous children were forcibly separated from their families and placed in schools that were run by the Canadian government or Catholic Church. In 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was tasked with documenting the history of the schools and concluded that the establishment and operation of residential schools were a key component of a Canadian government policy of cultural genocide. With this very brief introduction to a rather large and complex topic, I would like to introduce today's expert, Professor Christa Scholtz, who has kindly agreed to participate in this episode. Professor Scholtz was born and raised in Edmonton, Alberta. She completed a PhD in comparative politics at Princeton University. She is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at McGill University. She researches and teaches in the areas of settler Indigenous policies and politics, comparative and Canadian politics, constitutionalism, and federalism. Her work has appeared in the Canadian Journal of Political Science, the Canadian Journal of Law and Society, and the University of Toronto Law Journal. She has published a book on the comparative development of Indigenous land claim negotiation policies in Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and the United States. Today's interview will be conducted by Christina Webb, Project Assistant of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Canada. Christina, over to you now.
Thank you, Professor Scholtz, for joining us today. Your research focus is on Indigenous policy and politics. So can you tell us a little bit about why you chose this subject and how has the most recent events impacted your work?
First of all, I want to say thank you and just a few words auf Deutsch. Dankeschön für die Einladung und leider, ich kann das wirklich nicht auf Deutsch machen, aber ich hoffe, dass das interessant ist. Danke. Okay, so there we go. I started this kind of journey as a PhD student when I went to start my doctoral studies, and I was not going to do anything like this. I wanted to do a completely different subject matter, but then I kind of fell out of love out of that subject matter and kind of stumbled around to trying to understand some of the politics that was happening in Canada at the time in the 1990s. And then I was interested in comparing what I saw was happening in Canada with other countries, particularly Australia and New Zealand. And so when I dug a little deeper, it came to my attention that what we're really at the kind of heart of the questions I was interested in was this encounter between Indigenous peoples and the Canadian state. And so trying to understand the rights that Indigenous peoples claim for themselves and the authority that the Canadian state claims for itself, that there's a great deal of conflict between those two visions of this place. And so that's what I came to study. Really to understand the responses of governments to the demands of Indigenous peoples for their rights, particularly to land. So that's how I came to do the work that I now do. It was not something at the time very well studied. I thought I could make a contribution. And it's kind of a lesson of keeping your mind open when you go study, that you can study different things that you would have never thought you would when you started. So that is kind of the start of my journey.
Great, thank you. So, for our German viewers, can you give a brief explanation of the history of Indigenous policy in Canada?
Okay, so I think this is in some ways an impossible task, but nevertheless, I will do my best. So the problem, of course, is that it's hard in that the only way to be brief is to actually highlight some things while downplaying or obscuring other things. But I'll try nevertheless to give your viewers a way of thinking about, or kind of a basic way of understanding some eras of history that I think are really important to understand what's happening now. So it's not irrelevant to talk about the past. It's really important to understand the context for what we're living in now. So going back, I would say there is this really important kind of age of first contact, of intersocietal contact, starting in the 1500s till I'd say about the mid 1700s, where much was established, exploration of the continent, trading networks, commercial networks between Europeans and Indigenous peoples in kind of northern North America. Important involvement and engagement by Christian missionaries. So contact in a kind of religious or sacred sense, military alliances, and some limited settlement, usually settlement related to trading networks, particularly the fur trade. So there is a whole, long time of contact where I would say Indigenous peoples in this territory had important power and the upper hand. This started to change. So in the mid 1700s, the British and the French started fighting over who would take control over the territory as far as they were concerned in terms of that kind of colonial competition. And long story short is that the British won over the French. And for my purposes today, what's important is that in the 1760s, through a royal proclamation, the British monarch, King George, made a really important policy decision that would carry through until today, would have these echoes till today. And in this document called the Royal Proclamation, the British Crown promised to engage with what the monarch wrote in this document, his Indian subjects, that the British Crown would engage with Indigenous peoples in this territory in order to negotiate with them. So the British said we were going to establish a negotiation policy with Indigenous peoples For what the British were particularly interested in was to acquire what they called the Indian right of occupancy. So the rights that the British recognized Indigenous peoples of having to occupy the land over which the British were now asserting their own sovereignty. So for German viewers, this is really important because it started a treaty-making history of engagement that when Canada was created in 1867, that the Canadian government continued. So with the creation of, this country called the Dominion of Canada in 1867, the chief priorities of the Canadian government were to expand, to consolidate that power, and to settle. And as far as the government was concerned, what that required was quite simply to get Indigenous peoples out of the way. So that required a displacement, sometimes just, physical geographic displacement, having Indigenous people move out of the way, but also that they should also kind of a cultural displacement, deeply ingrained in the thought of people in 1867 was that as non-Christian peoples, Indigenous peoples were uncivilized, right? They were viewed as inferior. They were viewed as, and the language used was that of savagery. And so part of a central policy or motivating philosophy underlining Canadian policy towards Indigenous peoples was the civilizing mission. So to make that happen. So that happened in a couple of ways, many ways, but there's two that I will highlight in particular. One was treaty making. So to continue this policy of engaging in treaties with Indigenous peoples for the purpose, as far as the Canadian government was concerned, primarily to have agreements where Indigenous peoples would cede, surrender, and release. That's the language used in these treaties. Cede, surrender, and release their rights to a large parcel territory of land in return for some consideration, whether that be lands called reserves over which Indigenous peoples would have exclusive access, annuities, payments, and also things that would allow these communities to transition to a new way of life, right? So ammunition provisions, education provisions. In one particular treaty, Treaty 6, a medicine chest clause. So there was this engagement of treaty making where the Canadian government entered into legal obligations with Indigenous peoples for the purpose of moving them out of the way, physically out of the way, as far as the federal government was concerned. The other kind of big piece to this is the federal government also started to regulate the lives of particularly First Nations peoples through statute, through law, particularly a law called the Indian Act. And this Indian Act both recognized treaty rights, but also became increasingly coercive and restrictive and became the primary tool to try to assimilate Indigenous peoples into, I guess, Canada. And that kind of assimilation mission is the context under which the residential school system was set up. So there's lots of these changes, and I'll just note that Canada didn't get into making any treaties anymore as of the 1920s. It kind of figured it didn't need to. And it was really after kind of the Second World War, starting the 1970s, where Indigenous peoples in Canada really started to build political advocacy organizations that really changed the politics. And so there has been a resurgence and a real change in politics since then. And part of that led to the recognition or the constitutional entrenchment of Aboriginal and treaty rights in the Canadian Constitution in 1982. So that is a brief, incomplete history, but hopefully helpful.
Thank you so much, Professor. I think that that was a great start to an introduction on a very detailed topic. And to dive in a bit deeper and go off some of the language you were just using, it's common practice for government agencies, universities, and other institutions to acknowledge Indigenous territory. So, for example, here in Ottawa, Carleton University acknowledges the location of its campus on the traditional unceded land of the Algonquin Nation. So, why do people use land acknowledgements, and what's the meaning behind words like unsurrendered and unceded?
Okay. It relates directly back to the language included within the treaties that I just talked about. So I think back it up just a second. States make the claim that they are either the owners of land outright, what Canadians would refer to as crown land, or that states are sovereign over those lands, so that states claim for themselves the authority to make rules about land that landowners have to comply with. So in that story, there's nothing about Indigenous peoples in that story. It's about state power. And so a land acknowledgement really complicates those assumptions. It complicates those claims that the state makes. A land acknowledgement says, like when you're doing a land acknowledgement, you're recognizing that the land on which you work or you live is a space where an Indigenous nation or a political community also asserts rights and responsibilities. And so it acknowledges that this place, this territory is complicated and contested in terms of a political and a legal space. And so when we use the language of here, this is unceded or unsurrendered territory, that means that the Indigenous community of this territory did not engage in a treaty to surrender or cede rights. So it's an acknowledgement of a treaty history where that treaty history exists, or an acknowledgement that there is work to still be done.
To provide our German viewers with a little bit more information and context, can you shed some light on the history of residential schools in Canada, what their purpose was, and why they were incredibly problematic?
So this is how I will try to talk about a topic that is complicated and nuanced. It starts with understanding that the history of kind of an education policy and Indigenous peoples in Canada is deeply, deeply steeped in a Christianizing view of the world. So, back in 1867, right, the federal government, rather than the provinces in our federation, were given the power, according to our constitution, to legislate and develop an education policy for Indigenous children. The word used in the constitution is Indian. But education for what? Like, for what purpose? And the overriding understanding of what the purpose of educating Indigenous peoples was to fix what was wrong with them, right? If you understand Indigenous peoples as uncivilized, and key to civilizing people, first of all, that is a good thing. The key to doing that is to Christianize them and to kind of take away, weaken, get rid of their own cultural understandings of the world. So the central animating idea here in terms of an education policy was that the point of educating children was to remake them, to change them, to prohibit the transmission of language, to prohibit and stop the transmission of culture. And in its extreme, that requires removal of children from the family, right? And that this is not just about teaching trigonometry. It's not about teaching biology. This is about fundamentally remaking the students in front of you. And if I characterize this way, that it is to understand the central animating purpose to be a violent one, right? That to civilize, to Christianize, was to fundamentally change, to remake, and that, as Indigenous peoples have argued, is violence. And so we need to understand that the physical, sexual violence that occurred in these schools is layered on an existing kind of violent structure. Great. So that's not a happy thing to talk about. But history is complex, it's nuanced. I'll just say that the history of residential schools, 1880s to the 1900s, is about growth. It's about expansion. It's about setting up a system where the federal government would pay, but the churches, Christian denominations, Christian churches would actually administer the schools. So it was very much a partnership between the state and religious authorities. There's lots of variation in where these schools were, how they were set up, how isolated children were or were not. By 1920, attendance was mandatory. So they changed this thing called the Indian Act to make attendance by children mandatory. So what this meant is that children attended schools at either the threat of or actual use of force by the state. So the police could come and take your kids away. The apex of that system was really till about the 40s and 50s. And it started to wane, say, about the 1960s, when they were secularized and then gradually closed. So controversial for all the reasons that I just talked about, but also for the trauma of the survivors, trauma of the parents and communities, and for the way that that trauma has reached and replicated across generations. So that's how I would talk about it.
Thank you. So staying on the topic a little bit, but bringing it into current issues, John A. Macdonald has been recent subject of a lot of controversy, and many Canadians have mixed reactions on how his legacy should be preserved in Canada. So for our German viewers, John A. Macdonald was Canada's first Prime Minister, and he had a profound role in the implementation of residential schools. So what do you think? Do you think taking down statues and renaming places is a viable solution? How do we deal with this part of Canada's past and its most prominent figures?
Yeah, I mean, John A. Macdonald was a key figure in Canadian political history. He was Prime Minister for a long time. So he is kind of a profound architect of Canada as a country. I want to kind of, my answer to this question is to back up a little bit, because I think in this case, what the case of Canada and John A. Macdonald statues is part of a bigger question, right? It's about a politics of commemoration in public spaces. So what do we do when we're putting a statue or a memorial of some sort in a public space? And to me, what this means is by putting a statue or a memorial, somewhere, it's saying, like, we in the here and now, we believe that this event or this person is really important for these particular reasons. And that this is not just a private matter, right? That this is really something important, and that we are right and that we are correct to tell all of those who will frequent this space now into the future that, this is something important to know. So if you put up a statue or a memorial, that act is not unbiased. It's not neutral. It's a deeply biased thing to do. And that these are biases, these statues, for instance, are biases that get incorporated into our public spaces, into our built environments. And so we just kind of walk by these biases all the time. So the question that's interesting to me is, what we're doing is we're watching people grapple with how bound are we today to the beliefs and convictions and biases and perspectives of our predecessors, right? So what are the biases that we hold today? And should we just put up new statues, like add to the biases that we build into our public space? Or should we take down old statues? Should we unbuild them? Should we literally trash them and thereby reject the biases of our predecessors? Or do we put them in a museum? Like, what do we do? So to me, this is all about how we engage with our past. And what are we conveying about what our current commitments are? So I think reasonable people can disagree about what to do. Do you put old statues in a museum? Do you just take them down? Like, what do you do? Do you put a new statue alongside an old statue? I think those are reasonable disagreements. I just don't think it's reasonable or correct to argue that our built environments are somehow neutral. Like they're just neutral history books fashioned into concrete or brass or marble, and that therefore we can't touch them, we can't change them. And so that's what I think this is all kind of about. And so am I kind of personally attached to John A.'s statue being somewhere? No. I understand the arguments about why people are saying that statue needs to go. Like, I understand that argument, but I also understand this is a really deeply political thing. Although I'm a political scientist, so that's what you should kind of expect me to say to some degree.
Thank you, Professor. You definitely pose some interesting and critical questions. Indigenous people in Canada face many hardships. To name a few: drug use, mental health issues, lack of safe drinking water on reserves, challenges of preserving their own culture and language, discrimination, and overrepresentation of Indigenous people in Canadian prisons. Do you think these hardships are rooted in any similar cause? And how can Indigenous communities be better supported?
I think that intergenerational impact of trauma is real. Like, that's real. And this reality plays itself out in lots of different ways in Indigenous communities. And they can play themselves out in the statistics that you just mentioned. But I also think the answer is more than just residential schools happened. It's true, but incomplete. I think the answer is really also deeply about how we understand Indigenous peoples as being authorities themselves, and how they and their political systems relate to the authority of the Canadian state. So I remember, listening to an Indigenous scholar at an academic conference, such as one does, once say, the problem isn't settler colonialism. The problem is settler colonialism. It's not settlers per se. So if we accept that colonialism is really about denying Indigenous peoples the authority to make rules for themselves and kind of in our political systems, in our shared territories, to me, that's the big picture. Like, that's the big abstract picture behind the statistics that are often easier to focus on. It's a question about who gets to decide about prison policy, who gets to decide what the rules on what is crime and what is not, who gets to decide about housing construction, about whether pipelines are built, about which languages are taught in schools, in which schools, about who has control over education policy. To me, those statistics are backgrounded by those bigger philosophical questions. So that might sound a bit abstract, but that's kind of really what I feel to be the case.
The missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls crisis has been a critical issue in Canada for a long time. Indigenous women and girls are at disproportionate risk and face among the highest rates of violent and nonviolent victimization out of all population groups in Canada. According to Statistics Canada, Indigenous women are 6 times more likely to be killed than non-Indigenous women. What factors contribute to these women and girls facing such a high risk for violence and harm?
Like, why does misogyny exist? Like, why do women face violence in a way and an extent that men do not? Like, and every woman on the planet has asked herself this question, I think, at some point in her life. So why is this violence and vulnerability normalized? And why do Indigenous women and girls deal with more of it than at higher rates than non-Indigenous women do? Like, those are like big questions. And I don't necessarily have the answers to these questions. They puzzle me deeply. But I think that the histories and the policies that I've alluded to, described, at least in a preliminary way, should help all of us understand why Indigenous women would on average be more marginalized, more unsafe, more traumatized, more killed. It's not by accident.
Since July, Canada has had a new Governor General, Mary Simon, who is an Inuk from northern Quebec, and she is the first Indigenous person to hold the post. For our German viewers, the Governor General is the Queen of England's representative in Canada. What key role will Mary Simon play in reconciliation in our country?
Well, it's kind of a little bit up to Mary Simon, but I want to answer this question by giving a little bit, your viewers, a little bit more of a context in terms of the crown, right? In terms of the role of the Queen, not just in Canada, but with respect to Indigenous peoples. So this is the context in which Mary Simon's appointment has been made. So Canada was created again in 1867, a new country, but still part of the British Empire. And so the choice was made that the Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland would be Canada's head of state. So the Governor General exercises legal executive power as the Queen's representative. So that has since changed a little bit in that we refer to the Queen now as the Queen of Canada as the head of state. And that is a legal office that Elizabeth Windsor currently occupies. So going back to the historical treaties that I was talking about, it's important for your viewers to understand that the historic treaties that were negotiated after 1867, in particular, were conducted by treaty commissioners who acted formally at the behest of the Crown. So the treaties were conducted with the language and the understanding that the commissioners represented the Queen, right? Represented at that moment Queen Victoria. So I actually grabbed some text from a particular treaty, Treaty 6, and this is how it starts, right? It says basically, these are the articles of a treaty between Her Most Gracious Majesty the Queen of Great Britain and Ireland by her commissioners, and the Plain and Wood Cree and the other tribes of Indians, inhabitants of the country within the limits hereinafter defined and described by their chiefs. So the treaties are understood to be an agreement or contract between the Queen and their Indigenous signatories. And so what this history does for treaty nations is set up and establish a special relationship, a special legal relationship between themselves and the monarch, with the understanding that the monarch has obligations to them and that those obligations are confirmed in the treaties, and that Canada has the obligation to implement those obligations. So given that history, it is historic that the representative of the monarch, right, representative of the head of state, should herself now be Indigenous, even though the Inuit never themselves engaged in a historic treaty with Queen Victoria, for instance. So, but it is nonetheless important symbolically that the representative of the monarch herself be Indigenous. I also think it's really symbolically important because of who Mary Simon herself is, right? So she's not simply or just a member of the Inuit community. She's not merely Inuk in that sense. She has been a constant advocate and political representative, a very effective one for the Inuit throughout her whole storied, varied career. And so she is deeply familiar with Indigenous politics, not just Inuit politics. She has been a constitutional negotiator. She has been a voice and an architect of the Constitution that now recognizes Aboriginal and treaty rights. And so I find it very interesting that she was appointed to her current position, given her deep engagement as a constitutional actor in Canada.
Thank you. So to wrap up our interview, now that you've touched on a little bit about how the Canadian government can promote reconciliation, how do you suggest that everyday Canadians like ourselves do our part in supporting Indigenous communities and taking our own steps towards reconciliation?
This is a really interesting question. I get asked by non-Indigenous students at McGill all the time. This is the question that I get asked: how can I help? And it's an important question. It's a good question. It shows an intention to engage with people in a better way. And that's good. Having someone just kind of show up in an Indigenous context and say, hi, I'm here to help. That's actually not a selling point, right? And residential schools were set up by people who thought they were helping in a bizarre kind of way. So I always try to push students to rethink what it means to help, expand and really sit down and think about what does it mean to help. And so part of the answer to that question, I think, is take responsibility for your own learning. Part of the reality of growing up as a Canadian is that you didn't necessarily learn this history. You didn't learn what it meant to grow up in a place with a treaty, or that there was a treaty, or even what the terms of that treaty meant. So I think helping means taking responsibility for your own education. So read the TRC's report, read Indigenous authors, read their novels, read their plays, read their stories, watch their documentaries, watch their movies, read the treaties, take a course, right? Do that work. I think that is helping. I think that's what you have to do before you can actually engage with Indigenous peoples in a constructive way. And I wanted to leave your listeners with a bit of an anecdote. I sometimes ask my students to, answer a few questions, just give me a few answers to questions that I pose about the courses that I teach. And I asked them once or a few times, why did you take this course on Indigenous politics in Canada? And one of the best responses I ever got from a student was the following. And it was, I go home at Christmas and my grandpa at the dinner table says all kinds of stuff about the Native people he sees downtown. And I just don't know what to say. I just don't know what to say. So the student writes, I'm here because I need to figure out what like what the conversation is going to be with my granddad at next Christmas dinner. And I thought, that is brilliant. That is exactly what people should be doing. So I counsel students who want to help learn, read, and then engage with those people who you're close with, these friends of yours. Talk to your family member at the dinner table, the one who's saying jokes that aren't actually all that funny, to share with them some of the things that you kind of learned on your own journey. Things like, did you know that this treaty says this? Did you know that the town down the road, like this happened in the town down the road 30 years ago or 5 years ago? Did you know this thing that I always thought was true or just assumed was true actually isn't true? So I think that is very useful and helpful engagement. That, to me, is helping.
Thank you so much, Professor Scholtz, for participating in today's episode and educating us on Canada's Indigenous people and some of the challenges that they face. The Canadian government and Canadians still have a tremendous amount of work to do when it comes to dealing with and acknowledging the past and reconciliation of Indigenous peoples.
Great. Thank you so much for your time.
We are already at the end of this episode. Thank you for watching today's episode and your interest in Canada. If you would like to find out more about the work of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and dive deeper into Canadian politics and other topics, you will find interesting publications on our homepage and social media. Thank you, and we look forward to welcoming you back for another episode of Kanada Mit C.